Hello, everyone. And thanks, Deborah, for sitting down and giving us a better, I want to say, qualitative look at a lot of the numbers, a lot of the data that you guys have been compiling and putting together. And, you know, every year's always different in terms of new trends we're seeing. Our projections have changed. Let's take a broader look. What have you seen? What's the biggest change right now? Where are things headed in terms of the on-the-ground view that you've gotten?
Thanks a lot. And by the way, you know we're not going to do this the traditional way. I'm not going to be able to help but ask you some questions along the way.
Okay. I'll answer the best I can, but I want you to have the answer.
So how I would answer that is, I think Donna just teed it up beautifully by saying how much more rapid the change is. And at first I was thinking as I went throughout this year and I traveled globally that maybe it's just because I'm on the ground in countries all over the world this year that I'm noticing so much change and that I'm noticing it being more rapid. But I don't think that's the case. Maybe I had a better view into it, but I think the change is really rapid. So we heard a little bit from CJ about how there are some segments that are still in growth mode, while in another territory they could be in deep decline. So for instance, I was in India several weeks ago, and I was meeting with the CEO of a newspaper company. And his big challenge is he's got a growing middle class, he's got increasing literacy, so he's got a growth business that's a more traditional publishing business.
In print.
In print. But he's recognizing that he's not going to get the eyeballs of the next generation unless he's digital. So he still has the money in the base. And this is sort of a microcosm of what we deal with across every segment, across every country. But it was really brought home to me there because he's got limited resources, and he's got to decide how much do I put into digital, even though my money for the next few years is really all in print.
So it's interesting because it's a 20th century and a 21st century sort of business issue he's trying to solve at the same time, which is grow the print business, but at the same time figure out the digital business because the next generation is not going to be necessarily reading in print. Are there areas around the globe that you've seen similar or other types of opportunities that are unusual or different or challenging?
One thing I can't help but point out for anyone who hasn't quickly skimmed every single page of that document already is that the U.S. has been number one in every segment historically to date. And in the next 12, 18 months, that won't be the case anymore. China will overtake the U.S. in box office revenue. We can't tell exactly what day it'll happen, but it will happen at some point in the next 9 to 24 months, if you will. And that's kind of a big deal. And so we see a lot of a change in revenue base, in growth base, and a lot of countries moving positions this year and over the next few years. And the other thing I would say that was dramatic is we've already talked a lot about how dramatic mobile growth is and how it's at the center of everything. But this also gets to a big theme that one would think that as infrastructure, including Wi-Fi, whether it's fixed line or mobile, becomes more ubiquitous around the world, that the entertainment and media opportunities would be more ubiquitous around the world. But it really isn't that way.
Why is that? You mentioned China. I think China is an opportunity for all types of businesses. I think for media and entertainment, it's especially sort of challenging. And I think that's one of those aspects that are still being sorted out. A lot of government regulation, or it changes year to year, month to month, depending upon how they feel about certain things. What are ways in which, if you're a U.S. company, if you're a traditional player in that world, how do you break into China in the right way? There have been experiments, there have been sort of co-productions, those kinds of things, but even those things have sort of not really taken off the way that they expected to. So what do they need to do?
Okay, so that's a really complicated multi-part question.
Yes, that's what we like to do here.
So let me say there are multiple ways you can think about that where the U.S. or non-Chinese companies can benefit. For one thing, as I was saying that there may be infrastructure increases and continuity even in China as China becomes has more and more connectivity. But because of the way that has evolved, there are different business models in China that we can actually learn from in the West. So that's one category. For instance, we talked the other day about Wechat and how that's an entirely different way of using chat than most in the West use chat. So there's e-commerce and communication and video and literally things that in the U.S. we would go to, we would go online, we would go on our phone, we would go to an app. They do everything through WeChat.
So for maybe those who may not be familiar with WeChat, it's one of the most used apps on smartphones in China. It's essentially a chat app, but what they've done is, as pointed out, they've folded in all other aspects of the internet into this one app: shopping, messaging each other, paying your bills even. And I think that's an aspect to how the internet, at least mobile internet, is evolved in China in a way that it hasn't in the U.S. It's not actually something that Facebook itself is trying to learn from and do. Is that something, do you think, that will actually, that can be applied to U.S. consumers?
That's interesting. I think one of the reasons why it exploded in China was because they have different pricing models around voice versus data than we do, right? So back to the fact that you can't just look on the surface. You have to look underneath and say, what drove that business? Why did that develop in that way versus how we've developed our business models and our technology? So I think we can learn from the great interconnectivity and with the immersive experience. I think that's the biggest place where there's a learning, is there's such an immersive experience. Once you go in, you stay there. They have you, right?
So you're going to watch your favorite TV show on an app on your phone as opposed to turning on your TV or even logging on desktop. Is that?
And then you're going to do all your shopping and you're going to talk to your friends about it, right?
So that's clearly one lesson to take away. What are other lessons?
Yeah.
I mean, whether specific to China or elsewhere, especially if you're a producer, if you're in TV or if you're in movies, some form of entertainment, what's the best way for them to crack into China?
Well, first of all, you better get smart about what's going on the ground. This is not for the faint of heart. There's huge growth in volume of activity in China, but as you mentioned, it's a constantly changing environment. I've been in communication with our partners in Hong Kong and mainland China a lot in the last couple of weeks because they're doing the same thing we are. I don't know whether it was a few hours ago or a few hours to come that they're doing the same kind of event that we have here, one in Hong Kong and one in Shanghai. And because there's such an interest in, from the Chinese perspective, what are the opportunities for non-Chinese in China, that they're spending a good portion of their event actually detailing out the complexities of those restrictions that are going on right now. So we all know that there are now 34 non-Chinese films that can be distributed in China each year. But of course, you have to understand the genre and the content restrictions and what can be.
The censors,
right,
yes.
Exactly. So there's that. And then there are co-production opportunities also with nuanced restrictions. There are joint venture opportunities also with nuanced restrictions. So there are opportunities to be on the ground in China in a lot of different flavors, but you really need to work with somebody local that is deep into understanding those restrictions, because even if you understand them today, they will be different tomorrow. Now, I have spoken to some executives from a few of the Chinese companies who are here in the U.S. really looking for U.S. investments. And we all know, anybody that follows this at all, that there's been a lot of activity, right?
Right. There's a lot of activity from Chinese billionaires looking to buy into American entertainment. They've already been doing it. I'm sure if you guys are following the Viacom saga, Paramount is maybe still up for sale in some form, or at least up for an investment. And there are definitely some Chinese firms interested in that, if that goes through. Though, of course, given all the changes at the top at Viacom, who knows if that's going to happen. But the point is, there is interest from Chinese firms, from Chinese producers, into trying to break into either American audiences or American companies for investment. That sounds like an opportunity for sort of like, if you're a U.S. company wanting to do a co-production with, say, a Chinese company, having that same company sort of find opportunities in the U.S., is that something that's an opportunity?
I think that's a wonderful way to develop relationships and get to understand from the inside what the opportunities are. So, and maybe that's one of the better, most near-term, an easier opportunity is to look at inbounds, right? While you're exploring opportunities on the ground. I'm still long on China. I still think, as complicated as it is, with the large volume of growth there and the exploding cinemas, I forget the number, but there's this incredible amount of cinemas.
They're going to see more movies. They're going to, right.
Every week. and entertainment and media growth outpaces their economy. So it's
So even with regulation, even with piracy, China's still a good, potentially good bet.
I still think you have to be there.
What about other regions around the world? I mean, sort of staying on the same topic with whether it's television or movies or some form or another. Is India a good opportunity for Western companies looking at South America or the EMEA region? Ballpark that for us. Give us.
Yeah, I like India.
Okay.
I like India. I think that when I mentioned I was there recently, I just think the energy and the amount of interest in working with non-Indian companies is high, and they've always had a very rich and robust entertainment community. In fact, there's a really great article, again, in the special report about the entertainment industry and the explosion there in India.
It's fast growing. It's English speaking. It's democratic. It's capitalist country. There is, of course, vast differences in culture from state to state within India, and I think that may be a challenge sometimes for these things, but clearly they have a big interest. What might be the pitfalls? Whether it's India or other regions, what do people need to look out for?
Well, I think it's maybe the same categories of concerns that we talked about in China, but less so. So again, the theme is you need to know the specific market, and you need to have people on the ground there to work with to really understand what the complexities are, both around the content and around the regulations. The regulatory environment, as we've already discussed today, is becoming more and more complex, and you really need to understand that.
I think that's another sort of way to think about that. I think looking at entertainment companies expanding around the world, I think Netflix is one of these companies that have done really well in the U.S., but I think their growth now is really coming from international. I think, but from what we've heard is that they're actually having a harder time trying to break into local markets in terms of the original content factor. You can't just do a version of Orange is New Black in these other markets and think that it'll translate because it's just a different culture. So I think that's one of the, to your point, they have to figure out the local market. It also sounds expensive, though, to be able to do that, right? You're sort of recreating the same business over and over again. Producing content is expensive, learning the local custom, et cetera, all that kind of stuff. Is that feasible? Does that make sense to sort of make that jump?
Well, a couple of things. One, I think what they originally said, at least publicly, was that they were going to largely stay with the content that they already had and deliver that into local markets. And I think then they quickly saw that every country is different and every country has different appetites around content. And that strategy, I think we've all seen that evolve. But the other thing I would say is that in my travels this year, I thought it was wonderful to see so many of the entertainment companies really take a much more aggressive, vigorous look at their OTT opportunities, at their ways of connecting with their consumers on the ground. I think we have one of our partners from South Africa here. I don't know where Vicky is sitting. Somewhere in the room. There she is. Hi, Vicky. When Vicky and I went with one of her clients in South Africa several months ago, I know that they were really aggressively looking at how do we compete in this marketplace if Netflix comes here. So in some ways, and this is just my personal opinion, I see that this could be, that has been a very positive thing to get more people, more companies looking more aggressively at all the ways that they can connect with the consumer. So, supercharged it in a way.
So maybe a homegrown company, a homegrown streaming version, a homegrown version of a Netflix potentially would have a better chance than Netflix itself, despite the fact that one's got a much bigger purse
or maybe there's room for both.
Or maybe room for both. So maybe investment, co-investment, sort of that kind of thing. Yeah. So we're on the topic of OTT, which is one of my sort of favorite things to discuss, largely because within the media and entertainment space, especially in the U.S., it's the traditional companies. It's the Turners, even Viacom, Fox, Time Warner. They still control the biggest part of the media and entertainment business in this country. And there's an infrastructure to how television is working that's worked well for decades and decades. Of course, it's now being chipped away at. Cord cutting, Netflix is here, Amazon's doing it. Who knows what Google and Apple are up to next? So you're seeing lots of the traditional players starting to make that slow pivot to OTT, or over the top, meaning we saw HBO do it with HBO Now, which I thought was actually a pretty significant move, even though, for months and years we knew some version of that was going to happen. the point is, I guess my question for you, and to whatever insight you can offer on this, at what point do these traditional players make a more concerted effort, a bigger marketing push into selling directly to consumers, going over the internet, sort of bypassing their traditional cable partners? When and if and how is that going to happen?
You think I have a crystal ball that clever?
Of course, that's why you have all the numbers.
And actually,
your best guess, your best,
and
what's
actually, you said something just now that you referenced the other day when I asked you, and I will answer your question, but when I asked you, what did you think one of the biggest differences were, you said HBO Now, that you thought that was a pivot point.
I do. I think for years and years, HBO is a good example in a lot of ways, which is it's always been a standalone. It hasn't been part of the bundle, right? Traditional media company has a bundle of channels that they're selling to distributors, and there's an interesting economics at play out there. HBO has always been a standalone, even though it's part of the whole Time Warner universe. I think for years they had toyed with this idea of like, well, we're a standalone. People like us. If more people could see where we are, they would just pay for us. And the cable distributors for years had used sort of HBO as a marketing leverage, right? You want HBO, you got to buy into this package, even though you didn't really technically have to. So there was this ecosystem at play, which is the cable operator said, we'll extract more dollars from each subscriber if we market HBO this way. HBO is like, well, I want as many people to pay for HBO as they want. So there was always that tension. Finally, that tension broke where HBO's like, you know what, we're now going to just go directly to the consumer. There are enough people online who may just want HBO. They don't want to buy into a full cable package. They don't want to pay $100 a month just to have the right to pay for HBO, right? So that was, I thought, a pretty big deal. And it was the first signal that from the traditional players to the distributors, look, guys, it's not happening anymore, so we need to now go directly to the consumer ourselves. And I think...
but I don't know if I agree with the it's not happening anymore.
Okay, so let's get into that. Cord cutting, cord shaving. There are fewer people signing up for cable than they used to. It's not falling off a cliff by any means.
Right.
It's a very, very incremental drop. So why is that not enough?
Well, we talked the other day about one of the other publications that we have. Some of you may have read called VideoQuake. We've now done, which is basically a study of how the consumer's reaction to over the top. And this is the third year that we did that study. Just came out recently. And not surprisingly, like other studies, it says people are spending more time than ever with video, okay? Now, there's lots of categories underneath video, right? We've just talked about a lot of them. So people are spending more time with video. And in fact, one of the interesting insights that we saw was that, in fact, for part of the demographics that we studied, OTT is incremental. They're not all cutting or shaving. OTT in some cases is incremental. So it gets back to something that Donna was talking about, which is you really need to understand that whole environment. You need to understand the consumer. You understand what they're looking for relative to content and distribution. There is more money available through different channels. It's a question of really understanding what that right mix is and evolving with it.
So that's a good category. The incremental argument, which is the opportunity for over the top for finding your customer online directly, is relatively small. Maybe 10 or 12 million by some estimates versus the 100 million who pay for cable or satellite altogether.
It gets a lot more noise, right?
A lot more noise, but I guess sort of the way I've viewed this is at what point, I think a lot of that is a function of, I don't want to say, it's not as simple as just marketing the product, but just basically making more people aware this thing exists. Mm-hmm. You can do it this way. Even Amazon Prime, which I don't know how many Amazon Prime members are in the audience, but for years there was a free video part of that a lot of people didn't even know existed, for one thing. It's
still free, isn't it?
It's still free, but a lot of people who have Amazon Prime don't even know they can watch a lot of these videos, right? So it wasn't actively marketed. I think Amazon is now more actively marketing. So even from the native OTT players, right? I'm calling them native OTT players, even though that's not what they are. They've never done a great job. Some of those people haven't done a great job of making clear to potential customers, you can pay $10, $12 a month and get all this free video at the same time. So I think there was a weird détente going on, right, between traditional players, even the newer players. This thing exists, but you don't have to don't go diving into that just yet. I think the more it's actively marketed, if say HBO were to sort of more actively market that 10 million would be much bigger. I think, and year to year, it will just continue to grow, just because all those kids in college, traditionally they would sign up for cable the year or 2 years after they got out of college. I think that's not happening anymore. They've got their Netflix account, they've got their parents' HBO account. I think if they think that, oh, I can get my own for $10, maybe I'll just do it, versus paying the $100 for a cable bill that they don't know that they want.
Yeah, but there's one other complexity here that we haven't discussed yet, and that is that, are you only going to use Netflix? Are you only going to use Netflix and Amazon Prime? Are you only going to use Netflix, Amazon Prime, Hulu? I mean, at some point...
Looks like another bundle, right?
It's a different style of a bundle. And so one of the things that, I remember, I think I told you this the other day, I remember talking about this 10 years ago at variety conferences at CES, the big question of discovery and curation. Who's finally going to figure that out? And now we have a broader discussion around discovery and curation and who's going to figure it out across more types of distribution.
And it's much harder to find now because I've got all these services that we're talking about, including cable, and I'm hunting around each different app, including the cable box. Like, where does this exist? Can I find it? Can I get it? And then I just give up after a few minutes because
And you sign up for a new kind of bundle.
Or I just turn on live TV and I'll just watch whatever's there. I think this is actually a good moment. Why don't we open up some questions from the audience if you have any, or things you want to sort of get at. I'm sure there's at least one or two that you want to delve into.
One thing we didn't talk about, if we don't have a question right away,
Yeah, go ahead.
is we talked a little bit the other day about the explosion of mobile advertising. We've already heard a little bit about that.
It's going to be half of mobile advertising will count for half of all internet advertising in whatever it is in the U.S.
in
by
the next
2020.
5
Right,
years.
exactly. So that's a pretty big deal.
Like almost a third worldwide. But that's another. You all notice that there's a big theme in everything we all talk about, which is that you start here with a really big trend and an overarching statement, which is probably not true to very many companies, because you got to dig deeper, deeper, deeper. It's the same thing with that comment, that there will be this explosion of mobile advertising. And we know that for a variety of reasons, but how are we going to get there? How are we going to do that? It's very tricky because you've got a lot of privacy issues. You've got this device being the most personal device that anybody's ever had. You have format issues. That's still not figured out.
It's still a small screen. So I think if you are a marketer, what is the value of that to you? How do you get your message across in a way that you're not used to doing? Just because you're traditionally used to big splashy page on a magazine or 15, 30-second spot, that's taking over the entire screen of your television on your phone. It's just the ad experience is kind of crappy. So how do they win on that? What do they do?
Well, some of it has to do with targeting and personalization, although I've always thought that that can go too far. One of the things I'll reference again from the special report is I interviewed Carolyn Everson, who is the global CMO at Facebook, and they had I would argue to some extent, figured this out based on the fact that they now have 80% of their revenue is in mobile advertising. And what they did was, according to Carolyn, is in 2011 they just said, stop, we've got to figure this out. We have to be mobile first. Let's figure out the consumer experience. Let's figure out that immersive consumer experience, what it's going to take to have that experience, and then we'll figure out how to monetize it. And in fact, we have Jim Underwood, who is the head of their entertainment and media vertical. He's going to be interviewed as a keynote at our San Francisco Outlook launch next week. And you all can watch that on Facebook Live, similar to how today's on Facebook Live. We'll have next Thursday live, and he'll be actually sharing that mobile advertising story and how they've been effective doing that across data and formats, et cetera. Some of the big open questions.
What's interesting about mobile advertising right now is a lot of the activity around spending online is trying to get people to download other apps. So Facebook, for example, has done a great job of really ramping up its mobile advertising, but that's because a lot of the advertising that's being sold for that is download this app, right? So people are already on their phones or on their Facebook, and oh, there's this other app you can also download. It sort of reminds me of the early days of Facebook itself when it was online, where Zynga was really the main advertiser. It was the game on Facebook. So it has that same feeling. There is still this brewing tension between Silicon Valley and Madison Avenue where...
And you work in both, right?
And I work in both, which is that the traditional marketer wants a nice brand association. They want a good ad. They want, beyond just selling more stuff, having the ad sell more stuff, they want it to look good, have a good association. Silicon Valley wants that as well. Facebook keeps talking about how they have a Super Bowl audience every day. They want those big brand advertisers, but the advertisers they're actually getting are these smaller, incremental, download this app ad or sort of direct response stuff, which is what has driven a lot of the internet advertising for years and years. They still haven't quite cracked into that big brand advertising yet, largely because of the formats, because of how these things work, because you can see very nakedly, oh, that ad didn't work despite how beautiful it was. And so I think that's still, when is that going to, like, how and which can both sides solve that issue? That's going to be, I think, that's a big question for both industries.
Yes, it is, but it actually has everybody's firm attention right now. It's clearly, I remember for years it was, well, that sort of incremental digital extra will be nice if we have it, but we're really not going to focus there, right? And now there aren't any executives in any part of that ecosystem that don't believe we've got to figure this out, because and we'll hear about this when we hear from Beatrice from Me Too shortly, because her whole target demographic is really youth, right? And you saw from CJ that there's a direct correlation with populations under 35 and dramatic entertainment and media growth fueled by digital, fueled by mobile. So everybody gets this now. They absolutely have to figure out mobile advertising, an immersive experience that's not distracting, that takes care of privacy, or they're not going to be able to continue to drive profitable growth.
An ad that doesn't look like an ad, basically, is the idea, right? We heard Donna Turner talk about how they're integrating more or working more closely with advertisers to kind of integrate better into the actual programming, reducing the actual ad loads themselves. It just, I think, and the way that a lot of internet advertising works now, a lot of digital publishers like BuzzFeed, for example, they're doing basically sponsorships of stuff that they're already doing as opposed to standard display advertising. I think it's still going to be a challenge to translate both for mobile and for traditional players, but that's something that over the next year or two or three, they're going to have to solve given how quickly money is moving in that direction.
Right.
In case there's anyone, oh, there's a question back there, okay. Well, so as a member of the press, I will I will say that.
Yeah, this, I think, back to you.
Yeah, back to me. Okay, so it's a great question. I mean, why are these big M&A deals happening if the idea, all this money's still in that space, if the idea is that fewer people are paying for cable? I think that is the answer. I think I would argue these consolidation is happening for that very reason, which is they're having a hard time. Traditional players, whether it's Comcast or Charter or Time Warner for that matter, they're having a hard time growing because people who want to pay for television already do, right? So you're now just stealing share from each other, and I think you're either going to steal share or you're just going to buy them, and I think that's partly a way to growth. I think they're also realizing the video part of their business is just the declining or flat business. The internet access part is the growing business. So I think the long-term sort of play there for a lot of these traditional distributors is to sort of flop how that business works, which is the internet access business eventually kind of becomes its own bundle, right? If you're paying $50 for broadband, and then maybe they become resellers of Netflix and Amazon Prime and HBO Now, all of a sudden you're paying near $100. It's just another bundle again, just in a different format.
Yeah, we don't know who the aggregator is going to be,
We don't know who the
right?
aggregator is going to be, but here's the thing. People will not give up their broadband subscription. Young people, people in college, people right out of college, they will absolutely buy that before they buy a video subscription, right? And so I think that's a way in, and I think that's where they're going to find growth. But until that happens, until that pivot really happens, I think a lot of it, from what I've seen and what I've been told, a lot of the strategy is let's consolidate, let's maintain footprint, and then get more margin on the internet side versus the video side. I don't know if that answers your question, but I don't know if you have anything else to add. Oh, there's a question over here.
Deborah, any insights on Brazil? And are you long on Brazil?
Oh, Brazil, that's a good topic. We haven't really, okay.
Yeah. I am less long on Brazil, but I still think it's a very important market. And I still think again, you have to understand that market and you have to be there. And I think that over the next couple years, that market will become much more viable again for a variety of reasons. But if I had to pick one place to go, I would go to India. But you have to have a portfolio, so you can't just go to one place.
I think we had a nice free-ranging discussion. I think the key takeaways is just learning better the local markets outside the U.S. if you're going to really find those opportunities. We still haven't solved the OTT problem yet, but maybe we'll get there next time.
And we don't know how we're going to get to mobile, but we know we're going to make a lot of money there.
There's a lot of money to be made there. Just a matter who's going to take that share. But Deborah, thanks for your time and thanks for all the insight. Thank you.
Thank you.